The winter of 1873 laid a cold hand across the Montana frontier, hard and unforgiving as the iron traps Elias Boone set in the high country. Down in the valley, the small town of Bitter Creek lay tucked beneath the shoulders of the Bitterroot Mountains, a huddle of clapboard shacks, one saloon, a church that doubled as a school, and a wind that sang lonely hymns through every cracked window. That winter, Clara James lived alone on a half-worked homestead a mile outside town. Her husband, Thomas, had passed the spring before, taken quick by a fever that swept through the settlement like fire through dry grass. One morning, he'd been mending fence posts. By sundown, he was gone. The ground hadn't thawed yet, so she'd buried him under a cairn of stones beside the creek, where the water kept whispering his name. Now, the widow managed the place alone, one milk cow, 2 hens, and a mule too stubborn to die. The barn leaned like an old drunk, the roof leaked, and the stove burned low because firewood was dear. Still, she kept herself steady. Each morning, she lit the lamp, milked the cow, hauled water, and spoke soft prayers into the empty air. The townsfolk pitied her, but pity didn't put bread on the table. They'd say, "Poor Clara, she was too young to lose her man," and then they'd move on to gossip about something else. Only old Mrs. Goodwin, the postmaster's wife, stopped by with a loaf of bread or a kind word. Then, one hard December afternoon, a stranger rode into Bitter Creek. The sound of his horse's hooves broke the town's usual silence, slow, deliberate, confident. He rode a big roan stallion dusted with snow, and his coat was made of elk hide stitched rough and heavy. His beard was a wild man's beard streaked with gray, and his eyes, cold blue as glacier melt, missed nothing. He tied up outside the mercantile and stepped down with the ease of a man who'd lived more in the wilderness than among people. The townsfolk watched him from doorways. "Mountain man," someone muttered. "That's Boone, ain't it?" Elias Boone, the name carried weight. Some said he'd fought grizzlies bare-handed. Others said he'd killed a man up north and never faced justice. But all agreed Elias Boone was a loner, a trapper who'd spent more winters above the timberline than most men lived through. That evening, he came to the saloon for whiskey and stew, spoke few words, and listened even less. But before he left, he asked the barkeep about the widow who lived out by the creek. 2 days later, he came to her door. Clara had been hauling wood when she saw the rider cresting the hill. She straightened, hand on her hip, her wool shawl whipping in the wind. The man dismounted slow, his boots crunching the snow. "Mrs. James?" he said, voice deep as a mountain cave. "That's right," she replied, wary. "You've come far to find me, mister?" "Boone, Elias Boone." She nodded, waiting. Men didn't come calling out here unless they wanted something. He studied her a moment. The plain wool dress, the calloused hands, the defiance in her green eyes. "I hear you're alone," he said at last. Her spine stiffened. "That a problem?" "No, ma'am. It's a strength." He shifted his weight, snowflakes catching in his beard. "I'll speak plain. I need a wife, and I need sons by spring." The words dropped between them like a hammer on stone. For a heartbeat, Clara thought she'd misheard him. Then she let out a bitter laugh. "You ride all the way down from the mountains to say that to me?" He didn't flinch. "I don't waste time, Mrs. James. The mountain's no place for a man alone. I got a cabin built for 2. Enough land for stock and traps that'll keep us fed. But I'm getting on in years. Need someone who knows how to hold a home together." She stared, torn between outrage and bewilderment. "And you thought I'd just—" "Agree, I'm offering a life. Not an easy one, but better than starving out here alone." Her hands trembled, but not from the cold. "You've got nerve, Mr. Boone." He nodded once. "You've got grit. That's why I asked you." He reached into his coat and set something on the fence post, a small pouch of dried venison, another of coffee beans, and a folded paper sealed in wax. "I'll be heading back up the range before the snow gets worse," he said. "You've got 3 months to decide. When the thaw comes, I'll be back through this valley. If you're willing, I'll take you north with me." "And if I'm not?" she asked. He met her gaze, eyes unreadable. "Then I'll ride on." No harm meant, no word spoken. With that, he tipped his hat and walked to his horse. She stood there in the snow, her breath visible in sharp white clouds, watching the mountain man ride off until he was nothing more than a dark mark against the pale hills. Inside, the fire burned low. She sat by it, staring at the gifts he'd left. Coffee, real coffee, not chicory substitute. Dried venison, and the sealed paper. Curiosity gnawed at her until she broke the wax. Inside was a rough map, his cabin marked along Elk Range by a stream and a note written in surprisingly careful hand. A man can trap all the fur in Montana and still die alone. I aim to change that. You've got the courage of 10 men, they say. I'd rather have that beside me than gold. E. Boone. Clara folded the note slowly. Her heart was hammering. She told herself he was mad, desperate, maybe lonely beyond reason. And yet, there'd been something honest in his eyes, something she hadn't seen since Thomas. A kind of raw, quiet strength that came not from pride but from surviving too much. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind clawed at the shutters and the roof groaned under snow. She thought of the man riding alone through the storm, no home but the one he built with his own hands. By morning she decided she'd keep his letter, not burn it. Weeks passed. Life went on. She fixed fences, traded eggs for flour, and braved the cold. But sometimes when she walked to the creek she'd find signs. Fresh tracks near her fence, stacked firewood she hadn't cut, meat hanging from a peg. Boone's doing, she suspected. He wasn't gone, not really. Just watching from the hills, waiting. And though she told herself she'd never marry again, that she'd rather die free than live beholden, the truth was harder to face each night alone in that cold cabin. Maybe, she thought, the mountain man wasn't offering chains. Maybe he was offering a way out of them. Spring was still far away, but already something was thawing in her heart. The snows of January came hard across the Bitterroot Valley, a white silence that swallowed everything except the groan of trees and the mournful cry of wolves. Bitter Creek huddled against it like a frightened animal, every chimney spitting thin smoke into a sky the color of pewter. Up in the high country, Elias Boone lived the way mountain men always had, alone, half wild, and stubborn enough to wrest a life from the teeth of winter. His cabin stood near the bend of a frozen stream, built from hand-hewn pine and sealed with mud and moss. Inside, a fire snapped and the smell of venison stew filled the one-room shelter. He sat at the rough table, mending a trap, thinking of the widow down in the valley. Clara James. The way her voice had trembled between pride and hurt when he'd spoken his piece. The look in her eyes, green and steady, not the kind of eyes that looked away. He wasn't much for words. Never had been. But loneliness had a way of gnawing through even the toughest hide. The world was changing faster than any man could keep up. The fur trade was dying. Railroads were cutting through country that once belonged only to wind and elk. Men like Elias were becoming relics, ghosts in their own mountains. He had no family, no kin left back east. 2 wives gone, one to fever, the other to a fall during a hard birth. The ache of those losses had turned him inward for years. He'd sworn off women, off hope, off anything that could bleed. But after he'd buried the second one, the nights had grown too long, too empty. He wanted sons, not just to carry his name, but to carry on the land. The skill of trapping, hunting, reading the signs of weather and animal. He wanted to pass something down before time buried him along with the old ways. And then he'd seen Clara. He'd gone to town only for salt and powder. But there she was outside the mercantile, shawl tight around her shoulders, chin high against the gossiping stares of townsfolk. She had the same grit he saw in himself, a quiet refusal to break even when everything else had been taken. That night, when he camped outside town, he couldn't sleep for thinking of her. So he'd made his decision. He'd ride to her place, say his piece straight, no frills. I need sons by spring. Crude, maybe, but honest. Now sitting by the fire weeks later, he wondered if she'd cursed his name or laughed him off to the ladies in town. Either way, he'd given her time. He'd meant what he said, 3 months. Come spring thaw, he'd ride back down and ask again. Not because he needed saving, but because he wanted something worth staying alive for. Down in the valley, Clara James was still turning his words over in her mind. She hadn't told anyone about the mountain man's visit, not even Mrs. Goodwin. The whole thing seemed too strange to speak aloud, like some dream that lost its shape in the daylight. But the evidence of him remained. Those parcels of meat and coffee, the neatly stacked wood that appeared without a sound, the quiet sense of being watched not with menace, but with care. She kept his letter folded in her apron pocket, the paper soft from her fingers. Some nights she'd take it out by the lamp and trace the ink with her thumb, trying to read between the lines. A man can trap all the fur in Montana and still die alone. That line stayed with her. She'd seen what loneliness did to people out here, how it hollowed them until they were little more than shadows. She'd seen it in her reflection too when the nights got long and the wind howled through the cracks of her cabin. Still, she wasn't some damsel to be rescued. She'd buried a husband, built a life with her own hands, and she wasn't about to surrender to a man who talked about needing sons as if she were soil waiting for seed. Yet, she couldn't quite hate him either. There'd been something in his voice, rough as gravel but edged with honesty. He hadn't begged. He hadn't flattered. He'd simply stated his need, like a man ordering his life one hard truth at a time. A week later, the church bell tolled in town, Sunday morning. Clara hitched her mule and went, needing to see faces, hear voices, anything to keep from thinking too much. Inside, Pastor Wilkins spoke of renewal and faith, but Clara's thoughts drifted. Through the frosted window, she saw the mountains gleaming white and high. Somewhere up there, Elias Boone was cutting wood, mending traps, maybe thinking of her. "Mrs. James," a voice said after the service. It was Sheriff Dobbs, an old friend of Thomas's. "Heard tell that Boone fella's been sniffing around your place." She felt her cheeks warm. "He left some meat, that's all. Seems he thought I needed it." Dobbs frowned. "You best be careful with him. Boone's a wild sort. Lived more years with wolves than with folks." "I can handle myself," she said sharply. "I know you can," the sheriff replied, gentler. "Just don't mistake loneliness for love." That night, back at her homestead, Clara sat by the fire, the sheriff's words echoing. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe that was what made Boone's offer so dangerous. Still, she found herself looking toward the mountains more often, wondering what kind of man could live that long in silence and still speak so plainly of needing someone. February came with snow so deep it swallowed fences and froze the creek solid. Clara spent her days keeping the fire alive, patching the roof and writing in her husband's old ledger. Not accounts anymore, but thoughts, letters she'd never send. In one of them she wrote, "Thomas, I met a man who speaks like the earth itself, cold and steady, but true. I don't know whether to fear him or thank God he found me." As the weeks passed, her dreams filled with him. She saw his cabin in the pines, smoke curling into the gray sky. She imagined him by the fire, the silence between them soft instead of lonely. And so it went, the long winter grinding on. Boone's quiet kindness continued, more wood, more small gifts. He never showed himself, but his presence was everywhere, like the scent of pine after rain. Then one morning, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, Clara found a mark carved into one of the fence posts. 3 lines and a circle, Boone's mountain sign. Her breath caught. It meant I'm still here. She touched it with her gloved hand, heart thudding, and whispered into the cold air, "Then maybe I'm still here too." Up on the ridge, miles away, Elias Boone looked down through the pines toward the tiny speck of her homestead. He couldn't see her, but he didn't need to. He'd given her 3 months. And already he felt something stirring. Hope, maybe. A dangerous thing for a man who'd thought himself past the age of dreaming. When spring came, he'd ride down again, not as a trapper seeking help, but as a man offering his heart in the only way he knew how, plain, rough, and true. The winter deepened like a wound that wouldn't close. By February, Bitter Creek was sealed in white silence. Snow piled up to the eaves, the sky a dull gray sheet that pressed down on every soul in the valley. Even the wolves had gone quiet, their tracks swallowed by new drifts before morning. Clara James lived day to day, same as the rest. The fire burned low at times, the food stores thinned, and she often woke in the night to the sound of wind clawing at the shutters, whispering through the cracks. Still, she kept her chin high and her back straight. Every morning she broke the ice on the water trough, milked the cow, and fed the hens. Each evening she sat by the fire and wrote in the old ledger that had once held Thomas's accounts. Now it held her thoughts, private things she'd never dared speak aloud. Some entries were memories of her husband, but more and more they turned toward Elias Boone. "He hasn't been by since New Year's," she wrote one night. "Yet, somehow I feel him near. The woods whisper his name when I fetch water. I think of the sound of his boots in the snow, the weight of his gaze. Heaven help me, I think of him too often. It wasn't love, not yet. She wasn't fool enough to call it that. But the loneliness that had lived inside her since Thomas's death was shifting, changing shape, finding warmth where it shouldn't. In town, folks still gossiped. Mrs. Goodwin brought her flour one afternoon and hinted that a woman ought to think carefully before letting a man like Boone set roots near her heart. Clara thanked her kindly but said nothing more. She'd never cared much for the town's opinions anyway. The truth was, Boone had never forced himself on her time, never asked for more than she could give. He came only in quiet ways, a bundle of kindling left by the door, snares mended and hung neatly on her fence. Sometimes she'd find fresh venison waiting when she returned from town. Once she'd even found a small wooden carving, a mountain bird with wings spread, rough-hewn but beautiful. It sat now on her mantel beside Thomas's photograph. She told herself it was only kindness, but when her hand brushed that little bird, her pulse quickened like a girl's. Outside, the snow kept falling. One night, the wind rose so fierce that the roof groaned like a living thing. The fire sputtered, and Clara feared the chimney might give. She threw on her shawl and stepped outside, the world white and wild around her. That's when she saw them, tracks leading from the tree line to her barn. Human tracks. Her first thought was thieves. Her second was Boone. Rifle in hand, she crept toward the barn. The door stood ajar, snow drifted inside, and through the darkness, she heard the soft grunt of her mule and another sound, breathing, heavy, labored. "Who's there?" she called. The shape that rose from the shadows was tall, broad, and unmistakable. "Boone," she hissed, lowering the gun. "You near scared me to death." He looked worse for wear. Snow crusted in his beard, coat torn, one arm held tight against his ribs. "Didn't mean to frighten you," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Got caught in a slide up the ridge, needed shelter." She set the rifle aside and stepped closer. "You're hurt. Just bruised. Maybe cracked a rib. Nothing that won't heal." "You're near frozen," she scolded. "Come inside before you die out here." He hesitated only a moment before following her into the cabin. She stoked the fire, poured him coffee, and watched as the ice melted from his beard. He looked like a man carved out of the mountain itself. Scarred, strong, older than his years, but steady as bedrock. "You shouldn't have come down in this weather," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Didn't have much choice. Snow gave way under the ridge. Lost my pack, near lost my horse." She handed him a blanket. "You'll stay here till you're fit to ride." He nodded once, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. "Appreciate it." For 2 days he stayed, sleeping by the hearth, his presence filling the small cabin with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Security. He spoke little, only when she asked questions, but she caught him watching her sometimes, eyes soft despite their steel blue color. On the second evening, as the storm raged outside, she sat across from him, mending one of his shirts. "Elias," she said after a long silence, "when you said you needed sons by spring, was that truly all you meant?" He looked up slowly. "No, ma'am." "What then?" He rubbed his hands together, staring into the fire. "I've lived most of my life alone. Had love once, twice. Lost both to things I couldn't fight. Figured I was done with it. But loneliness, it's a mean kind of killer. Eats at a man. I wanted a home again, not just sons. A woman who'd understand the silence, who wouldn't fear it." Clara felt her throat tighten. "And you think that's me?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But when I saw you stand there that day, proud as any queen with the wind cut in your face and fire in your eyes, I thought maybe God was telling me not to give up yet." Her hand stilled on the sewing. "You speak plain, Mr. Boone." "It's the only way I know how." The fire cracked between them. Outside, the wind moaned like a ghost. She met his gaze across the flickering light, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then slowly she said, "You've got till spring, you said. That's still a ways off." He nodded. "I'll wait." And he did. When the storm broke, Boone rode back to the mountains, leaving her cabin quieter than it had been before. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. The days began to stretch longer. The snow softened on the hills, dripping from the eaves, turning the ground to mud. Clara worked the soil where she could, patching fences, readying for planting. And every now and then she'd look north toward the ridge, wondering what he was doing. The mountain man had said he'd return when the thaw came, and she found herself counting days without meaning to. 3 months, he'd said. By then she'd have to decide. But already, in her heart, she feared the choice had been made. For the first time in a year, Clara James felt alive again. The ache of widowhood had dulled to a tender scar. Where grief once lived, something new had taken root. Something dangerous, but warm. Hope. And when she dreamed, it was no longer of Thomas. It was of a cabin high in the pines, smoke curling from the chimney, and a man whose hands, rough as they were, touched her like she was the only thing left in the world worth saving. March crept over the Bitterroot like a long sigh. The air softened. The snow crusted and broke beneath the sun, and from beneath that endless white the earth began to breathe again. Streams cracked free of ice, their waters murmuring of spring. For Clara James, the thaw brought both relief and restlessness. Each day she watched the ridges beyond her homestead, waiting for that lone figure on horseback to reappear. She told herself it was foolish. Elias Boone had made no promises beyond spring. But still she waited. She'd patched the roof, cleaned the barn, and even replanted her small kitchen garden where the soil showed through. The cabin, once a place of mourning, now smelled of soap and fresh bread. But even as life returned to the land, a strange unease settled in her chest. The world never gave without taking something in return. One afternoon, as she carried water from the creek, she heard the distant thump of hooves, 2 riders fast and reckless. Not Boone. The sound was wrong, heavier, desperate. By the time she reached the yard, 2 strangers were pulling up to her gate, lean men with weathered faces and hard eyes. They wore patched coats and pistols low on their hips. One grinned when he saw her, teeth yellow against wind-burned skin. "Well now," the taller one drawled. "Ain't this a sight for sore eyes? Didn't expect to find such a pretty thing way out here." Clara set the bucket down, hand drifting toward the rifle by the door. "You're trespassing." "Easy, ma'am," the second man said, dismounting. "We ain't here for trouble. Just looking for a fella named of Boone. Elias Boone, you know him?" Her stomach tightened. "Why?" The tall one spat into the dirt. "He's got something of ours. Gold. We was partners up north till he ran off with more than his share. We just want what's owed." Clara kept her face steady. "Never heard of him," the shorter man smirked. "Funny. We tracked his horse this way." The first man's eyes wandered over the yard, then lingered on her. "Maybe we'll just have a look around, make sure you ain't hiding him." She stepped forward, blocking the door. "You'll do no such thing." His grin widened. "Ma'am, you don't scare me none," but she didn't move. The rifle came up smooth and steady, aimed dead center of his chest. "Then maybe you ought to be," she said. For a tense moment, no one breathed. The man's eyes flicked from the barrel to her face. He was sizing her up, waiting for a tremble, a blink, a sign of fear. He got none. Finally, he chuckled low. Feisty. "All right, lady. We'll be back. You tell Boone we're looking for him, and if he don't show, we'll take our payment another way." They rode off, laughter trailing behind them. Clara stood there, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. When they were gone, she locked the door, barred the windows, and stoked the fire high. That night she barely slept. Every noise outside sounded like boots in the snow. By dawn, she made up her mind. She'd have to warn Elias. 2 days later, as the thaw deepened, he came to her instead. She heard the horse first, then the knock, 2 firm raps on the door. When she opened it, there he was, tall and broad against the pale light, his beard trimmed, eyes bright with something like relief. "Mrs. James," he said, touching the brim of his hat. She didn't wait for formalities, just stepped forward and threw her arms around him. He froze for half a breath before returning the embrace, strong and gentle all at once. "Easy now," he murmured. "What's wrong?" She pulled back, eyes flashing. "2 men came looking for you. Said you stole gold." His jaw tightened. "They lie. We had a claim up north, 3 of us. They tried to jump it. I kept what was mine. They've been hunting me since." Her hands clenched in her apron. "They said they'd come back." Boone looked past her toward the hills. "Then they'll find me waitin'." That evening, he took up watch outside the cabin, rifle across his knees. Clara made coffee and joined him on the porch, the air cool but gentle now. The last of the snow was melting into rivulets that shone silver in the moonlight. "You could go," he said quietly. "Take the mule ride south. No shame in that," she shook her head. "This is my home." He looked at her, admiration softening his features. "You're a brave woman, Clara James." "Not brave," she said. "Just tired of running from ghosts." The next morning, the trouble came. She woke to the sound of horses again. 3 this time. Elias was already outside, rifle in hand. The men dismounted slow, the same 2 from before, with a third behind them carrying a pistol loose in his grip. "Morning, Boone," the tall one called. "We come for what's ours." "Then you'll die for nothing," Boone said, calm as a stone. It happened fast. The first man reached for his gun. Boone fired. The shot echoed across the valley, and the man dropped like a felled steer. The second dove behind the trough, returning fire. Clara grabbed her rifle from the door and took aim. The second shot missed her by inches, splintering the wood. Boone moved forward, firing again, clean, precise. The second man fell. The third tried to flee, but Clara's bullet struck the dirt near his horse's hooves, spooking it into a gallop. When it was done, the yard was still. Boone's shoulder bled from a grazing shot, but he barely seemed to feel it. Clara dropped her rifle, breath ragged. "You're hit." "It's not bad," he said, but she was already at his side, pressing a cloth to the wound, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. He winced, then looked at her, really looked. "You handled yourself fine," he said softly. She met his eyes, tears brimming. "I thought I'd lost you before I even had the chance to decide." His voice was rough but tender. "Didn't mean to frighten you that day I came. I said I needed sons by spring. Truth is, I just needed a reason to come down off the mountain." A shaky laugh escaped her. "You could have just said you were lonely." He smiled faintly. Didn't know how. That night, as she sat beside him by the fire, dressing his wound proper, the fear and the waiting melted away. He reached for her hand, calloused strong, and she let him. "I'll still wait for your answer," he said quietly. "Spring ain't over yet," she smiled through tears. "Then maybe you'll have it sooner than you think." Outside, the snow melted in earnest, water running free through the creek, carrying the last of winter's sorrow away. Inside the cabin, the widow and the mountain man found something new taking root. A promise born of danger, bound by quiet hearts that had finally found their match. By the time April rolled down from the high country, Bitter Creek had turned from white to green. The meadows were soft again, scattered with bluebells and tiny yellow asters that bowed in the breeze. The snowmelt came roaring off the mountains, fattening the creek until it sang loud enough to wake the valley. The world was alive again, and so was Clara James. Her days were filled with the simple, steady rhythm of spring. She mended fence lines, planted beans and corn, brushed down the mule, and found herself humming as she worked. The sound of her own voice startled her at first. It had been so long since she'd felt light enough to sing. The men who'd come for Boone had been buried on the far side of town. Sheriff Dobbs never asked too many questions, just nodded grimly when Boone brought word of what happened. "Self-defense," the sheriff said. "This country's got a way of sorting out its own justice." After that, the whispers in Bitter Creek began to change. No one called Elias Boone a savage or a killer anymore. Some said he'd saved the widow James. Others said he was bound to marry her come summer. Clara said nothing to confirm or deny either rumor, but when she caught her reflection in the wash basin mirror, the faint blush on her cheeks told its own truth. Boone stayed near, mending what the fight had broken. Fences, the barn door, even her faith in what it meant to share a life again. He never spoke of marriage, not at first. He just worked beside her, splitting logs, fixing hinges, keeping the fire warm at night when the mountain wind rolled down the valley. He slept in the barn, said it was proper that way until she gave her answer. But more often than not, they sat together on the porch long after the stars came out. Their words few but full of quiet meaning. One evening in mid-April, as the frogs began their song and the last of the snow melted from the peaks, Boone came up from the barn with a satchel slung over his shoulder. "I'll be riding north come morning," he said. Her heart faltered. "North why?" "Traps to check, a cabin to see to. Promised I'd be back come spring to hear your answer." His eyes met hers, steady and solemn. "Spring's here." Clara wiped her hands on her apron, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. And what if I still don't know what to say? He gave a half smile. Then I reckon I'll wait till you do. I've waited on winters longer than this. He turned to go, but she stepped forward, catching his arm. Elias. He paused. You could come back after you're done. Stay a spell. The creek's rising and the roof could use patching again. Might be I could use the help. He studied her face, saw the faintest shimmer of tears in her eyes, and nodded slowly. I'll come back, he said. He did. 2 weeks passed. The valley bloomed full, and on a soft May morning, Clara woke to the sound of a horse in the yard. She went to the window and smiled before she even saw his face. Boone was back, tall in the saddle, coat dusted with trail dust and pine needles. She opened the door before he could knock. Didn't think you'd keep your promise, she said, though her grin betrayed her. I said I would, he replied simply. You got my answer yet? She motioned for him to sit on the porch. Maybe, maybe not, he chuckled low. You're a hard woman to win, Clara James. I learned from a hard world, she said. They sat side by side in the sunlight. The air smelled of wildflowers and damp earth. Down by the creek, birds sang like they'd just invented the world anew. After a long while, she spoke. When you first came, you said you needed sons by spring. He nodded. I said a fool thing that day. Maybe not fool, she said softly. Just lonely. He looked at her then, the years of solitude and sorrow clear in his eyes. Truth is, I thought I was asking for a family. Turns out I was asking for forgiveness from God, maybe, for living so long without a reason. She reached out, touched his hand. And did you find your reason? He turned his palm upward, catching her fingers in his rough grasp. Depends on your answer. The breeze caught her hair, brushing it across her cheek. She smiled. You said spring was your deadline. Seems to me spring's about done. He raised a brow. So it is. Then I'd better tell you before the season changes. She took a breath, steady and full. Yes, Elias Boone, I'll go north with you. I'll build that home. Not because I'm lonely, but because I believe we've both done enough of our living alone. For the first time, he laughed, a deep, genuine sound that came from somewhere far beneath the scars of years. You sure? As sure as the thaw comes after the snow, she said. He pulled her close, slow and careful, like he was afraid she'd vanish if he moved too fast. The kiss they shared was not the fevered kind of youth, but the quiet, soul-deep joining of two people who had earned their peace the hard way. When they parted, Clara leaned her forehead against his chest and whispered, You still want sons by spring? He grinned, the mountain lines softening around his eyes. I reckon I want you first. That afternoon she packed her few things, a quilt, her husband's old ledger and the small wooden bird Boone had carved. They left the cabin standing, smoke curling from the chimney as if blessing their departure. Together, they rode north along the rising creek, the land turning greener with every mile. Boone's horse took the lead, her mule plodding behind. The world smelled of pine and promise. By sunset, they reached the lower slopes of Elk Range. Boone pointed toward the tree line. Cabin's just ahead. When it came into view, Clara's breath caught. It wasn't grand, but it was solid. Logs fitted tight, smoke curling from a new chimney, a patch of meadow nearby where wildflowers nodded. A place built not just to survive, but to last. She dismounted and stood in the doorway as he swung down beside her. You built this alone? He shook his head. Not anymore. Inside, the fire was already laid, a kettle waiting on the hearth. She set her bundle down, looked around, and smiled. Feels like home. Boone stepped behind her, his voice low. It is. That evening, they sat together on the porch as twilight bled over the peaks. The air was cool, the stars sharp as silver nails. From the cabin came the scent of bread baking in the coals. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her hand tucked in his. You think the mountains ever get tired of the cold? She asked. He smiled faintly. Reckon they just wait for spring, same as we did, she laughed softly. Then let's promise to never waste another one apart. Boone kissed her hair. Deal. The world went still around them, save for the song of the creek and the crackle of the fire. And there, beneath the wide Montana sky, the mountain man and the widow found what they'd been chasing all along. Not gold, not survival, but the kind of love that endures, season after season, thaw after thaw. That spring, the cabin in Elk Range filled with laughter and the smell of pine smoke. Elias Boone found peace and Clara James found her fire again, Together they planted roots deep in the mountain soil, strong enough to hold through every winter yet to come.